Hello, everyone, and welcome to another AMBA and BJ podcasts. I'm Victor Hedenberg, the Membership Director at AMBA and BJ, and with me today, I have a very interesting guest, Dr. Andrew White, who is the founder and CEO of Transcend.Space, and actually a former professor at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. So, Dr. White, thank you for coming on board for the podcast today.
Victor, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So why don't we start, very simply. Who is Dr. Andrew White? And a little bit about your background so everyone knows a little bit about that.
So I'm not going to take you right the way back, but I'll give you a bit of a précis. I spent 20 years at the business school at Oxford University, both in an academic role and also in a leadership role as well. I looked after all of our executive education and helped with a team of others to build out our digital platform, as well as all of our face-to-face work with leaders around the world. In my latter days there, I did a lot of research around what is the future archetype of leadership. So what's really emerging? And I wasn't really interested in that from an overly idealistic point of view, saying what it should be, but what's actually emerging and what are we seeing through concrete practices. And I also looked at how transformation happens, and co-led with colleagues at EY, who are our partners, a major bit of research on transformation. Again, very practically what's working and what's not working. Then in December of last year, I left Oxford. I founded my own company, Transcend.Space, and we're really, in many ways, taking that research forward. We're really focused on the development of the next generation of leaders and the development of the next generation of organizations in a nutshell. We call them Mountain 2 organizations. That's our language. You've got Mountain 1 organizations. They were really successful in the context of the 20th century. And we're really looking at what organizations are going to be very successful in the context of the 21st century with all the challenges we're facing. So that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. No, thank you for giving us a little bit of a brief background there, Andrew. So why don't we start a little bit about how you look at these four archetypes? What are the four archetypes? And I'm just asking simply because many of our viewers are obviously either MBA students or studying at master programs or undergraduate programs about business, and they will contain a lot of information about leadership. So I'm sure a lot of them are eyeing eventually to get one of those leadership positions or even start up their own company. So what would you say those different archetypes are?
So thank you. And this is what I've really been giving a lot of thought to over the last few years. And I think I see two major trends happening around leadership. One, I think if you go back to 2008, was this whole question of purpose. Leaders asking not just how do I get to the top, but why do I get to the top? Why am I here? And so we started to see a differentiation between what I would call almost ego-led leaders and purpose-led leaders. This goes back even further. Jim Collins' work on Good to Great, he talked about level 5 leaders, which I think is just another way of talking about purpose-led leaders. He talked about them being in service of something greater than themselves. So in essence, are they in the job for their own ego, for their own identity, just for money? Or are they in the job for something greater than that? Are they looking to have impact? Are they looking to understand what their role is in the world? And I think, if I'm honest, I see leaders really on a continuum. I don't think anybody is all one or all the other, but some you might say are more ego-led, and some you may say are more purpose-led. So that would be one continuum that I observed. And then the other is what I would call the incrementalist leaders. And these are the leaders that are primarily concerned with extracting value from the status quo. So they've got an existing set of products and services, an existing footprint of capital investments in factories or in supply chains or in ways of working, technology, etc. And they're making changes, but they're incremental in nature. They might call it transformation, but it's incremental transformation. So it's improving the status quo. And then you've got disruptors. people who are recognizing that the world needs to radically change. And the business needs to radically change. So they're rewriting the script, they're reimagining the rules, they're bringing in radically different technologies, and they're recognizing that there's something profoundly unsustainable about the status quo. And so when you put these kind of things together, you see almost there's four archetypes. There's leaders who are incrementalist and ego-led. They're incrementalist and purpose-led. I think you've got some that you might say are disruptors and purpose-led, and others that are disruptors and more ego-led. And I struggle to put people into clear boxes because I'm cautious about making judgments, but I think there are indicators of where people may lie. I'm also interested in engaging an audience in a discussion. So I love to do this. Where do you put people? Where would you see people in this? Where would you see organizations? Because I think organizations move. Then they're often not in one place, particularly big organizations, as they're struggling to understand how do they both deliver returns to shareholders and find what their role is in the world. Yeah. So I find hard judgments, let's call it social media type judgments, unhelpful. It's more about where there are the indicators, where might people be, and why might that be so? So what I'm trying to do is kind of lay a landscape that helps us understand. And perhaps for your listeners, it might be useful because where do they want to work? Where might there be a future career? Where might they learn some things? And where might certain jobs be more secure, certain jobs be less secure? Which companies are going in the right direction, which might you say are going in the wrong direction? So that's the essence. Purpose, an ego, disruptor, an incrementalist.
Great. And I want to go into a little bit more detail with those four, but before we do that, because you said something very, very important at the beginning here, which was that it's changed a lot since the Industrial Revolution in terms of how leadership, I suppose, is perceived, but also done in a more practical way. Why do you think there has been a change, first of all? Why we come to this point now?
Yeah, I think there's a profound shift we're going through. If you look back over the last 60, 70 years, there has been a dominant idea that's underpinned how organizations have grown and developed and been extraordinarily successful. And it's the idea of the machine. If you think about a lot of our organizations, we learned a lot through the manufacturing of cars, through the standardization of production, through business process reengineering, and IT systems came in, and HR policies. And you hear language around this when you're in organizations. You could say the 20th century really was about predictability, reliability, stock markets like that, companies like that. It was how things were organized. The problem with that idea is that it can cope with change of a radical nature when it's episodic, when you go through periods of change, back to periods of stability, back to periods of change. Because the machine likes stability. That's how it gets efficiency, and that's how it gets return. The problem with that is that in an age of continual disruption or continual transformation, which I believe we're in now, the machine doesn't work. It doesn't work as an underpinning idea. And I think we have to reimagine organizations as a living organism. And in our research, what we found was that when you want to transform, you have to put people at the center. And very simply, we see this when people organize a transformation project. Normally, what an organization will do is reach for a project plan. It will reach for a budget. It will reach for KPIs. They are the methodologies of the machine. And they're great. They're fantastic tools. We've got IT around that. The problem is that when you kind of the rubber hits the road of a transformation, it can go badly wrong, not because you got the planning wrong, because of people. And that's really what our research speaks to, is how do you complement the kind of the left hand of the machine with the right hand of the living organism. And it's not that one replaces the other, is that they both have to work together. And so in many ways, you could use another way of looking at it. We're learning to work with our non-dominant hand. And most organizations haven't trained people to be good at the people stuff. They've trained them in the technical stuff. And most people get to the top because they're good at delivery within the status quo. And then they have to work in a different way. So I think this is an edge around development. It's an edge around practice, around governance, around transformation. And if I'm honest, I think the organizations that succeed in the future will be the ones that know how to get the best out of people, being in a state of continual transformation. And that's about understanding emotion. And it's an understanding how to motivate people, how to engage people. So again, for your listeners, I think it's really important. Are they going to be working with leaders who get this? And there's a fundamental skill which we are trying to define. Superficially, we call it listening, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. And it's really about working with human energy. And that's where I think where the organizations that succeed in the future will be, both in terms of their ability to get the best out of people, but also from an overall strategic performance. You know, are they going to be delivering the best products, the best services that customers want?
Yeah, and actually, if I've read some of your previous work correctly, the art of listening to the silent room, in that understanding body language, understanding how people react to certain things, is as, if not more important as well. But how does one train to do that? Because it seems like some people are, have this inert ability to just perceive things really well, whereas others might not. Is that something one can train forward? And what would that actually look like then on a day-to-day basis at work?
So I'm going to give you a concrete example. I did a podcast with someone called Junaid Ahmed. He is in a senior leadership role in a company called Applied Materials in the US, and they were introducing robotic process automation to their finance function. And this was a piece of technology they wanted to put in. They did successfully, really to create a more efficient function. The problem was that when he announced this, and he said he initially thought it was an incredibly exciting thing, but the employees thought, well, robots are going to take our jobs. They didn't trust the technology, and so they thought it would undermine their professional kind of standing, or their aligning with their professional standards. And so it brought a lot of fear and anxiety. And he recognized this through Teams calls and from afar, because the team were in Austin and he was in the West Coast of the US. He realized something was wrong. He said, I just came in and sat in the back of the room, and I could tell that people weren't acting normally. There was something wrong. They weren't engaging with the supplier. We were, my language, a car crash in slow motion from the project's point of view. So there's something about observing what is said and not said. There's something about using open questions, not closed questions. There's something about using silence. And so there are techniques that you can use. There's also, I think, something about being aware that when you tell a group of people that something's going to fundamentally change, it disturbs their status quo. It undermines their sense of where their future is, their identity. It raises questions like, will I be able to do this? Will I have a job? Am I going to be able to work with this technology? Are you telling me the way that I've worked before is wrong? So, just being aware that when you disturb something, you disturb identity, you disturb power, and it raises a lot of emotion, and that needs space to be listened to. It also means, I think, and this is what the really sophisticated leaders realize is that it requires new ways of working. And those ways of working really show in practice that people are being listened to. It takes them on a journey of transformation from a point where they have no confidence to confidence, where they have a broken sense of identity that they have a role in the organization, to where they can see, it takes them from a place of being fearful about the future to being highly positive about the future. And what we found was this can take a week, it can take a couple of weeks. It's an intense workshop to create these ways of working, and not to rely on consultants. Consultants can do a good job to get that going, but ultimately the company has to own that and develop that. So there's something about listening to what's said and not said. There's something about silence. There's something about recognizing that true listening is about an action that gives people a sense that they've been heard and enables them to go through an emotional shift. And that emotional shift is really about, when you put it into an organization, the movement of human energy. And so the way I think about it is that you've got a kind of a rational project plan, and then you've got overlaid on that the kind of the messy human journey. And it's really about understanding when are things going to get difficult. And that's a turning point. And what we found was if you intervene right at the turning points, you get a massively disproportionate positive impact on success.
Yeah. I mean, so why don't we start then looking at some of those archetypes that you've mentioned? Because on the one hand, you have people like you could take Elon Musk, for instance. Now, I've never personally worked for Elon Musk, so I can't speak from that perspective. But I've read a lot from people who have. And many people see him as a brilliant leader in that he has a vision, very clear goal, gives people the ability and the flexibility to own, let's say, their space. But he can also shift very drastically. And one day you're his ally, and the next day you're his enemy, and you're out. And the transformations that can happen within not days, but literally hours, maybe minutes, some would say. So where would a leader like Elon Musk fit in, and how? Because from the perspective I see SpaceX and Tesla, fantastic results in what they do, but is it really the best way of how to treat people? Maybe it is for some, maybe it isn't for others. I'm not entirely sure, but what would you say?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm not about making categoric judgments of people. So let's talk about, what he is brilliant at. And frankly, what he has been far, far better than pretty much every leader of the older public companies. For my mind, he's created two outstanding businesses. One is Tesla. And let's be really honest, without Tesla, would the rest of the automotive world have moved into EVs? I don't think so. No. He was the one that had the confidence, the insight, the bravery. He put his own money on the line, and from the reports that I've read, worked the hours to get that business to where it is. If you look at Starlink, you and I would not be talking now. I live in a very remote part of the UK. I have a satellite dish on my roof. I think the broadband I can get through the telecom network here is about a meg, which worked 30 years ago, 20 years ago, doesn't work for this. And so again, where were the existing telcos? Did any of them have the foresight to do this? Did any of them marshal the capital? So there's no doubt he's an incredible disruptor. You look, there's other aspects of his behavior, which is he doing this for himself or in service of the greater good? If I look at what he's done with Twitter or X, as it is now, and I've got questions. Some of the political statements and some of the ways he engages, is it for the greater good, or is it polarizing? And it's part of the polarizing agenda. So, I've no doubt where he sits on the disruptor to the inquiry. He's a disruptor. and arguably the world needs more people like him disrupting industries and creating successful new ones. But on the purpose to ego, this is where it would be great to have some of your listeners. Let's have a conversation. Where does he sit? And I suspect there's going to be some different views. I wonder if it's more tends towards the ego side of things than the purpose. But we'd have to dig into the definitions of those words for people.
Yeah, of course. So would you then say that normally, someone who's a disruptor, but is more focused on themselves or their ego, will in many cases be bad for the people working in the organization, because ultimately many of the decisions they make will be maybe to the benefit of themselves and that in the here and now. I'm thinking of another organization I'm thinking of is, if you look at, for instance, if you look at the entire video game industry, it's been filled with companies such as EA, who are, releasing newly published games that do really well. Some of them do really well, and then they'll fire the entire workforce next, and because they're trying to be disruptive, they're trying to use AI, all sorts of things. But it also means a lot of people with lives or built up lives around this now all of a sudden are cut off. It seems to me that seems to be the connection of the disruption, but focused on, how do I or the few of us in the organization benefit out of this?
Yeah, and I think that's where we would start to get into exactly what do we mean by ego behavior and what do we mean by purpose behavior.
Yes.
And is it just about me, my money, my identity, and I'm using people as a resource? I'm also aware that in businesses where there's a lot of volatility, then, and particularly industries like gaming, then the people costs are often the highest. So, but there's a way of doing this, and there's a way of taking people with you on a journey. I was listening to an executive really recently from Microsoft, and they were talking about what they're doing around AI. And we were having a debate around what happens when you are asking people to, in a sense, download how they do their job in order to put it into AI that will then make them redundant.
Yeah.
And Microsoft said they're doing that, but what they're then doing is training those individuals to go out into what you might consider second or third tier organizations where they're not at that stage, where they can actually help them with that journey.
Oh, wow.
So they're giving them runway, they're helping them go through transpersonal transformation. And rather than seeing that as a threat, it becomes an opportunity in theory. So to me, that was where, a company's really taking care of its individuals, thinking about where they might be beyond their employment today in this organization, but where with your skills might you be able to go, and how might you be able to move into an organization that's less mature in terms of its AI adoption. I thought that was a really interesting case.
And that's actually fantastic, because you're actually taking ownership of the people as well in a way. You're saying, look, you came here, you had a job. We take responsibility for giving you, another shot out there in the job market, and by supporting you. Not very many companies do that. So, and I'm surprised, not in a bad way, that it's coming from Microsoft. So that's quite nice to hear. What would you say then are some organizations, in your experience, who have a very strong purpose behind? First of all, what do we mean by purpose? And secondly, what would be some organizations you've come across where this is definitely true?
Yeah. So, and let me be clear, I'm not really interested in organizations that espouse a purpose and don't do anything, or
of course,
try and retrofit their current operations. It has to drive change. So the original, I suppose, pioneer of this was Paul Polman and what he did at Unilever. And He, going back to 2008, we were coming out of the financial crisis. There was a recognition that banking had failed society, needed to be bailed out by government, that organizations had lost their way, they'd become too short term, they were too extractive of natural capital. And what Paul did, and I know him and I've worked with him and done podcasts with him, he, in many ways, reinvented business. He talked about stakeholders as well as shareholders. He shifted the reporting cycles. He brought in, the kind of the activists into the organization to actually help them change. Started to make major movements in terms of usage of carbon, uses of plastic, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that was almost wave one of purpose. It didn't, Unilever wasn't radically reinvented through that, but it was optimized. If I think about where we are today, and I think about what companies are really trying to do this, there's one where I would put very much in the purpose-led disruptor category as Plastic Bank. I did an interview with their CEO, David Katz. David is an extraordinary individual. The Plastic Bank, essentially, most of us look at plastic in the ocean and we think it's causing a real problem for animals and a real problem for coastal communities. David sees that, but he also sees an incredible opportunity, which is what he's done. So he raises money from consumer goods companies. He pays people in low-income countries where plastic is washing up on the beaches to collect it. That money goes into household incomes, into schools, into hospitals, so it addresses poverty. The plastic gets recycled and trademarked plastic for good. So he's doing something alchemical. It's disrupting the way in which we see plastic. It's creating a circular economy, not an extractive economy. It's helping organizations who are arguably the producers of plastic in the oceans actually address the problem. And it's shifting money into low-income communities. So he's created a disruptive business model. If you listen to him on my podcast, he's incredibly purpose-led in terms of what he's doing. I think he's an archetype of something amazing. There's another business called the Adara Group in Australia, led by someone called Odette Excel. Odette is a banker, but what she has created is an investment bank that does M&A activity and is in the kind of the forefront of capitalism, but also is a development agency that works with neonatal babies in off-grid locations. So they've got the two things operating in the same organization.
Wow.
So, and she's reinventing things. When I interviewed her, she said, I don't see any spiritual difference between an investment banker and a nurse. Both have the potential to do profound good. And frankly, I would prefer an investment banker come and work on a deal for me. I think the way she described it is they don't get paid in cash, but I give them a pay slip that's got all the things that their fee will go towards paying: motorbikes, nurses, tents, medical equipment. And they can generate far more for that activity through working on a deal than they can by writing a check for a donation.
Yes.
And she's mixing oil and water. Who would have thought you could have investment banking and development sitting in the same organizations? In a sense, you've got left wing and right wing, if you want to think of it that way. Two different types of people. So I think that's what these people do. They don't play by the normal rules. They're Elon Musk type in terms of the disruption, but they're bringing something different in terms of working with people. And there's something alchemical in how what they enable from people. Again, a question for your listeners: where do you want to work? Who would you want to work for?
Yeah, precisely. And I love that, the fact that you've I always, for myself, when I've looked at different charities and they're looking for money, they rarely ever say where the money goes. And I remember a very vivid case when I was at university, and there was a charity asking for money, and we did a little bit of a background check, and where does all the money go? And the CEO apparently had 2 houses and 4 cars, and you looked at how much of the money went towards it. But this was not, shared. Obviously, they didn't want to be transparent about it, but just doing something like that in your example gives people the opportunity to see, okay, well, this is money well spent. It's going to go to something really good. So that's wonderful and clearly purpose driven.
Yeah.
Now I want to bring in AI. It's difficult not to, given that we're talking about leadership, we're looking at transformation. A lot of the people that we speak with, many of the MBA students, many of the people graduating, the one thing that they're saying is a lot of jobs right now are being questioned. Questioned in the sense that actually this can be done by an AI. A sales admin can now be a sales online agent or bot that scrapes information, creates the let's say the script of what you're going to talk about, and all you need is someone to actually do the actual call, probably someone a little bit, maybe a business development manager or something like that. This is scaring and putting off a lot of people. So on one hand, you've got that. On the other hand, you've got the so-called leaders. And if you're replacing more and more people with, say, well, agents or bots within the organization that are automated tasks, where does the role of the leader sit? Or is this just an over-exaggeration? Will we always need more people than the underlying technology?
Yeah, I think it's a question of our time, if I'm honest. In the last 4 weeks, I've spoken to people who've talked about reducing their headcount by 85%, by 90%, and by 95%. Not across the whole organization, but certain functions like finance could be dramatically affected. And certain professions could be radically changed in nature and reduced in terms of capacity. So the job market, I think, is going to profoundly change. I think it raises a question, which is, who am I with AI? When I surround myself with all the AI tools, does that make me better or make me redundant? And if I'm honest, I think anyone who wants to work over the next 5 to 10 years needs to be asking themselves these questions. There are some jobs that are going to be replaced completely. There are some jobs that are going to be massively transformed, augmented by AI. There's some jobs that are going to be peripherally affected. And I suspect it's the jobs where there's a very high amount of human interaction. So I'm not sure that the assumption that's been out there really for the last, 50, 60 years, that I go through a degree, I go through an MBA, and there's a job for me. I've got a bit of a fight, a bit of a battle, a bit of a kind of process to go through to get a good job, but the jobs are there. I suspect that's going to change. It's going to require, I think, a shift in ownership onto the individual. How do I use these tools to accelerate? Because I think there can be profound acceleration, and in many ways, it's the younger people have got to play to their advantage, because they're the ones who are more, digital natives. They're more tech savvy, generally speaking. And they're the ones who are going to be able to perhaps accelerate their careers, because they're going to be able to use AI to augment what they do. And, skilling themselves up on some of these things. I'm at the moment researching, an AI-based recruitment tool, business development tool, and if I'm honest, I'm in many ways guided by the organization as to how to get the best out of that. Having somebody sat alongside me that could help me would be really useful. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here, but being passive and just expecting, to go through the recruitment processes and then find a job, more intentionality, more awareness of the different AI tools that are out there. What is the state of the art? What do I really love to do? To me, it brings us back to purpose. Like, who am I? What am I really good at? What could I be really good at? What work do I really love? It comes back to these questions, and then how does AI support that, augment that? And maybe it's replacing it, and you've got to go through a rethink.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And what would you say the role of a leader is in this situation? I mean, you're currently looking at different departments, you're looking at optimizing things, but you also might be a value-driven organization. And so what do you do with the people? I mean, this is a really tough question. So, and also going back to your original points about the importance of listening, I can suspect there's a lot of fear, underlying fear, that's not necessarily being talked about openly, but where a lot of people are afraid that, are we bringing in these tools to just replace us?
Yeah. So I coach now a lot of CEOs around the world in different organizations, and I see this challenge, very much at the top of their agenda. I think the first role is that of architect, or re-architect. You've got to re-architect your organization. This technology is going to affect a lot of different things. And so actually really understanding it, what it can do and what it can't do, what metrics is it really going to enable, the transformation around, is really, really important. In banks, this is around the cost to income ratio. Essentially, can we do more with less? Can we do things quicker? I'm hearing stories from a CIO that I'm working with. This used to take us 5 days, it now takes us 5 hours. Wow. I mean, huge compressions in terms of time and in terms of things like cost to income. So there's something about architecting. There's something about prototyping and actually showing the art of the possible in our organization. That's not easy, but it's the easiest bit. Then it's the bit around people. And often what I'm hearing is the difficulty we've got is either we simply don't need the number of people that we've got, or the people we've got are not willing to make the change. They're not willing to learn new technology and new ways of working. Or, it's what I talked about before. We have to decode you in order to automate you.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably one of the hardest leadership challenges. So, and I think it's possible to do. Money helps lubricate that. What I think really helps lubricate it is when you can help people see their future after it. And give people confidence that they're going to be able to pay their mortgage and their rent and look after their kids and all the other commitments that they might have, and have purposeful work. That is, I think, the single biggest challenges that governments might not realize they have, but that they have with this technology.
Yeah. Get
this wrong, and I think we could be looking at the long run of technological adoption coming to an abrupt, if not end, a massive hiatus. Because hitherto technologies work for us. I've not been in a bank in years. I love working off the app. It's brilliant. Works for me. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Would be in a really expensive, what was it? It was Cisco telepresence. Right. You'd have had to book it at your end. I'd have had to book it at my end. We'd have a big bank of screens at the cost, $1 million at either. I think it was something like that. Now it's a Teams app that we're working off. So technology has worked for us to this point. But at the point at which it doesn't work for a majority of people, and let's be honest, certainly in the West, our economies are not in strong places necessarily.
No.
The gaps between rich and poor have got bigger, all the stuff that we don't need to go back over. So actually helping people see a future for themselves, and a productive, a purposeful, an economically good future for themselves, I think is a really important thing. And so somebody said this to me. He said, we might be able to run our organizations on 5% of the numbers of people that we're currently using. But let's remember that our employees are also an indication of our customers.
Yeah.
So you start to run some numbers here. Something's got to change. And so actually a future after AI, or a future with AI, is a really, really important question.
In fact, just here in Sweden, for instance, what they've done now, just I think a month ago, in conjunction with a couple of AI companies such as Sana, was they've launched an AI in schools project, where, like in the 90s, where they had every student be equipped with a computer hooked up to the internet, they're trying to do the same thing with AI this time around. The idea being that people shouldn't fear it, people should leverage it for their own dreams, goals, and ambitions. Maybe they want to launch a business. Maybe they want to use it to excel in their work in one way or another. So there's some interesting ways of I guess, teaching people early on, and we'll see if it's successful or not. But I guess some governments as well, other than Sweden, are also considering this. What if we look at certain industries? Where do you see currently the biggest disruptions, and where do you see that things are perhaps not changing so much? Maybe the old mentality still prevails. I'm asking this from the viewpoint of many of our listeners who might be soon applying towards jobs or are already in that process of what to expect.
Yeah. So the one I think is most interesting is oil and gas, or energy.
Right.
If you think about where that industry has been in the last 10, 15 years, extraordinary innovation around solar and wind as the two main sources of renewable energy. Big statements around decarbonization, around shifting to a more disrupted future. And then in the last year or so, a huge swing back to the incrementalist.
Yes.
So, I see them in the storm, really, of, we disrupt, we pull back, there's like a pendulum that's swinging between these two poles. And as a result of that, I think, I don't know how many of them will make it to the future. What does the future of energy look like? At some point, I think it's going to go through a more radical tipping point, and a radical shift. And will the big suppliers continue to play the dominant roles that they've played? I don't know. They've got extraordinary technical capability, and have done some amazing things in the disruptive space, but the status quo is very attractive in terms of returns. So I think that they are in the midst of the storm. The one that I think is going into the storm is food. And I think the cost of, the harm that certain foods do, it's a bit like tobacco whenever it was in the 50s before it was taxed. The evidence is starting to come out. The healthcare costs are getting unsustainable. It's more of an issue in some countries than others. I think the US is probably in the forefront of this. And so, I've often wondered why, with the food industry as it's currently constructed, farmers don't do well who produce it.
No.
Consumers, with obesity and diabetes and things, don't do well. But is it in the middle are doing well? Both the FMCG and the retailers. So what's gone wrong? And so I think in the midst of that, something is going to shift, and I suspect it will be. You've got consumer trends, and I know this is happening in alcohol. That alcohol consumption rates are dropping. Both with an older generation for health reasons and a younger generation more from a social habit, I think, and health. So we're seeing it with alcohol. I think we're going to see it with food, both in terms of consumer behavior and preferences, but also regulatory intervention as well. And we're starting to see that in the US, and I suspect we'll see it in Europe as well.
And that will be a very interesting industry as well. I think, as you said, in the past, what's happened is a lot of those companies in the middle have been guided. And I know someone who's worked in the industry. They were guided by the fact that they wanted to get this consumer to buy as much of a product as possible. So how do you do that? Well, you introduce chemicals and things such as maltodextrin and whatever that gives you that, I'm not, I want more, I want that taste. It's not about health. It's not about anything other than buying more of that product. And that's the sad part, was that eventually that's what the industry has been geared towards, is those in the middle are the ones who profit and do really well. And then you've got the two other ends, the farmers, especially who struggle and can't survive without subsidies, especially in Europe. That's just impossible at this time. So no, very interesting.
And that's a crazy situation, isn't it? That farmers can't survive without subsidies when they are the ones producing food. Because if you think about it in terms of every other industry, you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
Certain things are, you make sure you pay your rent and mortgage. You decrease the frequency of your haircuts, right? You cut out holidays. That's where you start to make the cuts. Rent, mortgage, and food is right at the bottom. So how come and the farmers are producing it? So something's gone wrong here.
Yes.
And buying it direct from the farmers is more expensive than buying it when it's been through all of those logistics and all of that production. So I don't claim I have answers. I just have some questions around, if you want to know where the problem is, follow the money.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that really does need to be rethought of. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I suppose, an opportunity for MBA students who have a purpose behind something and say, look, this needs to be redone, because you're right. I think there was a book I read just a few years ago that was focused around the topic of, what makes an economy sustainable? What are the most important aspects? And there were really two things they mentioned. Number one was food, because you can't survive. We can have all the technology companies in the world, consultancies, and this and that, but without the food, we all die. And two was energy. Food and energy were the two most important ones. Once you have those, the rest of the economy can grow and flourish, and you can have a service-based economy. That works. But without those two, you're done.
And also, I was reading at the weekend that in the UK, our electricity costs 4 times higher than the US. So if you are a manufacturing business that's, working big machines, then it can become unproductive, not because of logistics or, demand, but just the electricity costs are just too high. So it's another factor to play into the reasons that you described. There's something about, is it good to do business in a place? You need both cheaper electricity, and these are two critical factors to the economic performance of a country.
Yes, absolutely. So then what would you then say, Andrew? Because again, we have a lot of young people, but people have done their completed just their MBA or about to start one. What should they be thinking about? Many of them will jump into leadership roles either right after or in a short time span. What are some things that they should definitely think about now while they've got the opportunity to do so?
Yeah. So I've started to use the language uniqueness and belonging. And let's call it the old world, or the world that's descending. In that world, you gave up a lot of your uniqueness in order to belong.
Mm-hmm.
If you went into a consultancy or into an investment bank or into many of the jobs that MBAs tend to go into. And sometimes that led to burnout, sometimes that led to huge success. I think in the world going forward, you need to figure out how to own your uniqueness and think about where you temporarily belong.
Right.
Don't get comfortable. Go into places, into jobs where you might actually learn some things for a year or two, but don't lose sight of what is my uniqueness. What is my uniqueness augmented with AI? What is it that I really love to do? Does that still have utility in the future, economic utility, or is it art?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and be prepared to reinvent yourself several times.
Yeah.
I think that's going to have to become the normal, and do some experiments along the way. You know, take a job for a year. You know, the other thing I would say is there are certain parts of the world that are booming and certain parts of the world which are more static.
Yes.
Right. For most jobs, I'm not sure Europe is necessarily the place I would want to be if I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do a lot of work in Saudi, in the UAE, in other parts of the Gulf.
Yeah.
It's got far more going for it, frankly, right now than Europe has.
Yeah.
Singapore and Malaysia, far more going for it, I think. So the US, for all its difficulties, I think has got a lot more going for it. So, you know, I would be thinking about where do I spend the first few years of my career as well. And where do I, when I, perhaps before I've got commitments that mean I have to put roots down, you know, where do I want to go and spend some time and gain some experiences? Because I think the world where Europe and the US and the associated countries were dominant, I think has gone. And I think there's other parts of the world that are really on the ascendancy, and, you know, getting some experience there would, I think, be very wise.
I think you hit the nail on the head right there. You know, I travel a lot. I get to work with many of the world's leading business schools and universities. And you're absolutely right. When I go to the Gulf region or Malaysia, where I was last year, you see this enormous boom, incredible focus on opportunities. There is growth. There are new companies popping up all over the place. And as you said, that still happens in the US. Whenever I come back to Europe, it feels like things are just it's always a struggle. I think probably bottles down to many of the underlying issues we have in the economy, everywhere from declining demographics to very high energy costs to perhaps maybe the regulatory framework not being conducive towards the sort of world we're moving into, which is very much about experimenting, staying in a job here, maybe doing a startup, maybe fails, but then you move on to something else. And it's this cross-pollination essentially that happens. And I see the opposite in Europe, where it's find a job, stay safe, and hope you don't get fired kind of approach.
Very good.
Very good, Andrew. Well, thank you so much. And if someone wanted to learn more about your research or about the work, where can they go? Where can they find us?
Yeah, the best place is LinkedIn. I'm very active there. I have a newsletter called Leadership 2050. and a podcast which I'm going to be restarting, which is also called Leadership 2050. And so, please reach out on LinkedIn. It would be great to connect, and I hope to see you there.
Fantastic, Andrew. Thank you so much for today's podcast. And for everyone listening, I'll see you for the next one.
That's great. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.